Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics for football, dual threat quarterbacks. And dual threat quarterbacks before they were cool, meaning guys in the 70s and 80s that kind of ushered in this era of the modern NFL quarterback. Today's NFL is full of mobile playmaking quarterbacks like Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts. There's a lot of them. But we Gen X guys, we remember when running quarterbacks, and that's the term they used to use, running quarterbacks, they were rare and criticized and doubted and written off by old school coaches. So today, let's explore how the early dual threat pioneers fundamentally changed quarterbacking long before this became mainstream and modern. Now, the elephant in the room is you cannot talk about this without talking about the fact that in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s even, there was a racial aspect to this that, you just can't talk about this without discussing. And that's the fact that these, a lot of white NFL owners didn't trust black quarterbacks yet. They just didn't. And, that's sad to say, but that's the reality of it. And so, most of us remember Doug Williams breaking the door down in the 80s, becoming a true, and the irony of that to me is hysterical, in that Doug Williams wasn't really that mobile. He was a pure stand in the pocket and deliver the ball type of quarterback. He was what I call a prototypical professional quarterback. And so, we're going to talk about guys that ran around a lot more than Doug Williams, but he was the guy that broke the door down with great success. And, eventually it got to where NFL owners started thinking differently. And what they started thinking was, hey, I don't really care what color my quarterback is or where he's from, as long as he wins football games for me. And hey, we know it took a long time, but by the 90s and early 2000s, we started seeing the turnaround. Okay, so that's the elephant in the room. Of course, there's a racial component to this. And yes, now we've turned a corner, and it's not that way anymore. It's all about winning. So really, before the Lamar Jacksons of the world were out there shredding defenses, and before Patrick Mahomes was running around throwing sidearm while he's running in the opposite direction, and before Josh Allen was out there hurdling linebackers and crashing into people at the goal line, before those guys, we had Randall Cunningham, we had Steve Young, we had Kordell Stewart, and before all of them, we had a guy named Fran Tarkenton. So that's the kind of guys we're going to talk about today. So before we talk about dual threat quarterbacks in the NFL, we have to kind of go back and remember what the NFL was in the 70s and in the 80s and even into the early 90s. Quarterbacks were supposed to look a certain way. They stayed in the pocket. They threw from a solid base. They were field generals, not necessarily athletes. And coaches wanted these statues back there delivering the ball in the small windows. Guys like Terry Bradshaw, Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, Troy Aikman, that type. If the quarterback took off running back then, the executives said, well, he must not be able to read defenses. And that's sad but true. Broadcasters would say things like, well, he doesn't trust his system, or he doesn't trust his receivers, or he doesn't trust his offensive line. And defensive coordinators had the philosophy of, fine, let him run. We'll break him in half when he gets near the sideline. We'll put him out of the game, etc. So the league culture, the guys that owned teams and coached teams and scouted, it was very rigid. Okay, it was rigid. We want the statuesque guy to throw the football. Every era, though, has pioneers, guys that just blast the door off the hinges, and somebody who's going to truly challenge, the norms. And this started happening really before I was born, some of it, but we really started seeing it with a few guys. And so I'm just going to give a few names to think about before we drill into some details. So here's some names to think about, the type of guys that I'm going to cover, and some of them in more detail than others. But Randall Cunningham, the blueprint. I'm proud to say that I saw Randall Cunningham play several times. I'm not proud to say that it was always as an Eagle, and it was always beating the Cowboys out in Dallas. However, I did see Randall play, and he's one of those dudes that made me want to go to the games early enough to watch him warm up. That's true. That's always been a thing of mine. I always want to get there early, watch quarterbacks throw, etc., and that's because guys like Randall Cunningham could put on a show just warming up. So he's kind of the blueprint, all right, of what we see today. He was the most electric guy, QB, of the 80s and the early 90s. And he revolutionized the position because he could run so well. But, and it doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but Randall Cunningham could throw bombs as good as anybody on the field. He could throw the deep ball. Most of us remember him from Tecmo Bowl. He's pretty dominant in that as well. Coaches didn't know always how to use him, but fans knew that when dude got out on the edges and things broke down, he could make things happen. And I mean not necessarily running, but he could roll out and throw a ball a long ways for sure. So we're talking about guys like Randall Cunningham. Also, how about a guy named Steve Young? Heard of him? He was kind of the perfect hybrid. He could run, he could throw, he could take hits. He was tough. There's footage of him just running unbelievably long touchdowns for a quarterback back in the day. And of course, he was overshadowed for a couple of different reasons and overlooked a little bit. One was that he played behind a guy named Joe Montana who won Super Bowls, 4 of them to be exact. So he was a little bit overshadowed, well, a lot overshadowed by Montana early on. But then Young, when he got going on his own with the 49ers, he became an MVP. And his mobility, it wasn't a gimmick. I mean, San Francisco adjusted to what he could do better than Montana. And so it ended up becoming a winning formula for them. And he got his team to the Super Bowl and won it as well. Another name from back when I was a younger man to think about, Kordell Stewart, Slash, they called him. He was way ahead of his time. And the reason they called him Slash, because he was a wide receiver, slash quarterback, slash running back. That kind of hybrid didn't have a name at the time, so they just called him Slash, and that was a perfect name for this guy. He had a big season in '97. Maybe we'll take a look at later. The modern NFL uses this term, Swiss Army knife players, and that's probably because of him, if we're being honest. There's another name that's not quite the traditional running quarterback, but I think there's different things going on here. I think there's running, true running, and I think there's also something called escapability. And the next guy that I'm going to mention was Warren Moon. And Warren Moon was very athletic. He had an elite arm. He's often overlooked in this discussion because he didn't have that much just pure yardage from running, but what he had was great escapability. And so he's in this conversation sometimes because of that. And that's because, much like Cunningham, even though he wasn't running the ball down the field, when he was a younger man, Warren Moon could go sideline to sideline, still scanning, still looking, and uncork, a fastball 50, 60 yards down the field for the big play. And there are other guys who could do that, but I'm mentioning Warren for a reason, is because he had just such an unbelievable career across 2 professional leagues. So he was often pigeonholed sort of as just a thrower, but he was incredibly mobile and crafty as a young man. And if he had just played in the NFL, he would have had numbers put up there that would just be astronomical and hard to beat even to this day, some of them. So Warren Moon's in the discussion. Also, maybe the godfather of this discussion is a guy named Fran Tarkenton. And I'm old enough to remember Fran Tarkenton playing. He was the original scrambler back in the day. He's really, he's really kind of the OG. He is. His improvisation was decades and decades ahead of what the NFL, felt was acceptable. Like I said, he played as a short guy, in an era where you're supposed to stand in the pocket and throw the ball. And so some of the stuff he was doing really had their offensive coordinators frustrated and had defensive coordinators sort of scratching their heads. So you can't talk about this without talking about Fran Tarkenton. So let's start with Fran, the original scrambling quarterback, running quarterback, dual threat quarterback. Tarkenton played back in the era when running as a QB basically got you benched. You know, they didn't script that stuff. All right, they didn't script rollouts. They didn't script a whole lot of bootlegs, which is unbelievable, but that's true. And quarterbacks didn't scramble around, you know, and stay behind the line of scrimmage for 10 to 12 seconds sometimes like he did, you know, because that was considered sandlot and backyard football. But Tarkenton did all of that. And he wasn't even that fast. He was just very slippery. And, you know, I've always had this term about athletes that I think is kind of funny, but he had speed in the box, meaning, you know, he literally could move incredibly fast in a very short, small area. And that's critical when you're in the pocket avoiding guys. And so, of course, he was called the mad scrambler. And scrambling implies that you're eventually going to throw the ball, right? Otherwise, you're tucking it and running it. So, man, the mad scrambler, he'd run backwards, sideways. He would loop around his pocket, come back to where he started. And just when the defense got tired of chasing him, he would flip that pass or zip that pass downfield. Man, he was a magician. He was. And he played like he kind of refused the limitations of what traditional quarterbacking had been, way ahead of his time. And he kind of forced the NFL to consider something that wasn't real cool at the time, and that's the fact that improvisation was kind of a weapon if it was used correctly. So maybe not all Gen X folks that are football fans, but certainly the older end of Gen X, and I'm kind of in the middle, but I do remember watching the Vikings in the 70s, and Tarkenton, he was something to watch. And like I said, he sort of dictated where the game was going to be decades later. And then you kind of had a lull after Tarkenton until the NFL sort of saw the next evolution. So after Tarkenton had kind of slowed down into the 80s, we kind of got a new archetype in the NFL. The quarterback wasn't just necessarily a passer, a thrower anymore. Some people started opening their eyes to the possibility that he could also be an athlete. And then that opened the door for the guy who changed everything, and his name was Randall Cunningham. If you're a Gen X football fan, NFL football fan, you remember this guy. Randall Cunningham, Philadelphia Eagles. He ended his career in other places. Ended up being a Cowboy. He ended up being Troy Aikman's backup. Most of you didn't know that, did you? The Kelly Green, Philadelphia Eagles, Buddy Ryan being the head coach, and that defense just terrorizing teams. And Randall Cunningham, man, he would just float in the air. He would just glide along the sideline. He wasn't a scrambler. He wasn't a runner. He was the mold, the prototype for the modern NFL quarterback. Long before Lamar Jackson, Randall was doing it with even less support and far fewer protections from the referees. Think about it. Randall was still playing when they let you just beat a quarterback into the ground. Not only that, Randall played when they let you beat receivers all the way down the field. That hadn't changed a whole lot. It eventually did. But his signature traits was an absolute cannon for an arm, insane agility. I'm talking like tier 1 wide receiver type agility. The ability to make things happen when there's nothing there. Highlight plays every single week. And, you know, like I said, a star in Tecmo Bowl. So Tecmo Super Bowl, I should say. And, hey, when you're a video game star, you got to back it up on the field, right? And this guy was just revolutionary. And here's the key, though. NFL coaches, it kind of took a while to figure out how to use him and how to defend him. They didn't build offenses just around his mobility. That stuff just sort of happened. And like a lot of mobile quarterbacks, they tried to turn him into a traditional quarterback. And that really limited his talents. And so, you know, whether he forced them to or whether someone along the way thought it was a good idea, they ended up understanding that what made Randall special was what he could do with his legs, on top of being a really, I say great, I think great passer Anybody can throw the ball deep downfield like him, I think you're a great passer. And so he started, all of this moving into the post-Tarkenton era. So whereas, you had Randall being explosive, Steve Young was a little more polished and balanced, and he was, he wasn't brave. Bill Walsh was a great offensive mind, and then later George Seifert took over. They kind of evolved their offense into fitting Steve Young after Montana left. He could run, throw, obviously. He could take a hit. He was tough. He was smart. Steve Young, I believe, is a lawyer. He went to graduate school while he was in the NFL and became a lawyer. He could diagnose defenses, and he was deadly accurate when he was rolling out. And remember, he was left-handed. So you have to think backwards when somebody's left-handed. These younger NFL fans think that Patrick Mahomes created, off-platform throwing, as Collinsworth loves to talk about on the telecast. But if you were Gen X, you know that Steve Young was doing it back then. And, Young was the first one, I think, of this crew with the Super Bowl that sort of validated that style that the critics and coaches and owners once dismissed. And so he made the mobility factor respectable finally. And our guy, Warren Moon, he's, like I said earlier, he's not always listed as a dual threat, but he should be. He was so mobile and strong and athletic when he was younger. But he had to hone his craft up in the CFL for probably all the reasons I talked about earlier. And his style wasn't about scrambling. His mobility involved what I called earlier escapability. Think about Roger Staubach and Archie Manning. You're not going to see those guys in Moon with a ton of scrambling or with rushing yardage and touchdowns, but they had escapability. And that's the ability to move around in the pocket and avoid the rush and the negative play and still find a receiver down the field, make the throw, and prevent a sack. And Moon absolutely had that. Plus, he had such an accurate arm. If you've ever seen footage of Warren Moon throw a football, it's one of the tightest, prettiest spirals you will ever see in your life. Check it out. And he pushed the league into accepting quarterbacks that didn't really fit old school stereotypes, okay? His journey sort of opened that door for the next era, including the guy that I'm about to talk about now. And that's Slash again. We're back to Slash. Kordell Stewart, one of the most fascinating guys that I watched back in the 90s. Wide receiver, running back, quarterback, gadget player, eventually full-time starter. He came into the league playing more wide receiver, running back, and backup quarterback, and then trick plays and special teams. And finally, he became the starter. And that's credit to him. In 97, he was way ahead of the NFL. Here's a name for you. He was Taysom Hill. If Taysom Hill could actually become the starter and, hone his craft a little more. He was Lamar Jackson in a league that wasn't quite ready for that yet. And he was the future for quarterbacks. His mobility changed offensive game planning, and his versatility forced defenses to prepare for things they hadn't seen on film yet. Because here's the other thing about Slash, despite all of that, unbelievable athlete. Speed, and, one thing all these guys have in common, besides the fact that they're considered mobile or escapable or whatever, they also had arms, man. Kordell could throw one, okay? And he wasn't necessarily consistently across his career like a Young or a Cunningham. But, man, he really changed what offensive coordinators thought was possible in the NFL. And nowadays, you hear this referred to sometimes as a positionless offensive weapon. And there were other guys. There was even another guy in Steelerland, a guy named Hines Ward later on could play three positions on offense. So that is the kind of door opening experience Kordell was, leading right into what we're experiencing today. Now, I've already mentioned that the elephant in the room was race and all of this, and a lot of black guys did not get their chance in the NFL because the owners and coaches just didn't want it. And that's true, and no one can ever deny that. However, there was something else going on as well. And if you were a fan back in the 80s, you could see it happening. And it ended up in a lot of, newspaper articles and Sports Illustrated and so forth. But that's this, and you can't deny this was happening. College systems and pro systems were not the same. if you're old as I am, you know there was something called a pro style offense. That's literally a set of formations, but it's also just a generic term meaning that pocket passer. Go back and look at footage from the 70s and 80s in the NFL. You are always going to see a fullback on the field. You're going to see one wide receiver out wide, and that's probably it. You're going to always see one tight end on the field. It's just totally different. And colleges were not doing that. Colleges in the 80s and the 70s too, they were big into the wishbone. Now, here you go. The option offenses. You could run the option out of the wishbone or the I formation, of course. That's where your athletic quarterbacks came into play. So even though, yes, there was a racial background to why so many African-American quarterbacks were running offenses in college, but not in the pros, it wasn't necessarily because they were black. I'm sure it was in a lot of cases, but it was also because for them and the white quarterbacks, it was also because the systems they were running in college looked nothing like NFL systems. And so, whereas in college, if you could be at Nebraska or Colorado or Oklahoma and run the option as a great athlete, you could get away with not being quite as accurate of a passer. And that doesn't matter what race you were. And so in the NFL, they, for decades, said, no, that's not what we want. We need precision. We don't care that you can run the ball. We want you to stand in this pocket. So along with the racist side of it, there were also so many successful college programs just flat out not running offenses that were compatible to the NFL. Nowadays, it's completely backwards, and NFL offenses are pulling from the college ranks, pulling up the quarterbacks and the offensive coordinators and the head coaches that are specialists in these offenses. And that's really what ushered in all of this change. Now you've got a lot better coaching and mentoring for quarterbacks who are athletes, first and foremost, regardless of what race you are. You've got better coaching for these guys. And from the 7th grade on, they're learning how to be good passers nowadays. And so if you add the athletic factor in, that's why you have what you have in the NFL nowadays. Back then, they didn't want these guys. They were seen as system QBs, option quarterbacks. Did you have a few that went to the pros in different positions? Absolutely. Drew Pearson was a quarterback in college. He became a wide receiver. There are others who played wide receiver, running back, safety, whatever. But eventually, those college concepts, they gained influence, and bootlegs, rollouts, sprint options, quarterback draws, all that stuff started trickling up, not down. And slowly offensive coordinators adapted, and suddenly the doors blew wide open for what's happening today. And, that is exactly how we got to where we are now. The fact that the NFL finally embraced the ideas from college. Do you see any parallels with today's guys and some of those guys I've talked about? Does Lamar Jackson remind you a little bit of Randall Cunningham? I think he should. He's got that DNA in him. Josh Allen, is he Steve Young except even bigger and tougher? Think about it. Jalen Hurts, is he a little bit more polished than Kordell Stewart was coming out of college? Kind of similarities there. And Patrick Mahomes and Warren Moon, there's some similarities there with Patrick Mahomes. Actually reminds me of Tarkenton, the way he would really prefer not to run it down the field. He's usually scrambling around back there looking for somebody open. So it's not gimmick. Okay, these guys are not gimmicks anymore. They're the standard. And they get drafted higher, they get paid more, and more entire franchises are built around these quarterbacks than ever before. But the foundation for all of that we're experiencing today, it was laid by these guys that I've mentioned and a few more. But we're gonna stick with the guys that I've mostly talked about, and let's look at a few stats just to give you an idea of what I've been saying. Kind of chronologically here, Fran Tarkenton had 47,000 passing yards. At one time, I think he was the all-time leader in passing yards. Okay. He also had 3,674 rushing yards in his career. And like I said earlier, he was where it all started, really. Randall Cunningham had 30,000 passing yards, close, and 4,900 rushing yards, pretty much 5,000 rushing yards, big number. Steve Young, 33,000 passing yards, 4,000 plus rushing yards. Warren Moon, 49,000 passing yards. That's more than Fran Tarkenton. Only 1,700 rushing yards. Like I said, he wasn't going to be as high in that list as the others, but escapability. And you could say the same about Staubach and Archie Manning and a bunch of others. Kordell Stewart doesn't have the numbers the others have because he really wasn't a starter for as long. But this rushing number of 2,800 yards, that's a lot for no more than he actually ended up playing in his career. And that almost 3,000 rushing yards to go with almost 15,000 passing yards. Let's talk a little bit about some of the highlight years for these guys. Randall Cunningham in 1990, I saw him play that year in Dallas. He had 3,500 passing yards and 942 yards rushing. I want you to remember that the gold standard, even to this day, even though they play 17 games now, and I think the numbers should change, it used to be that if you rushed for 1,000 yards for a running back, you were doing something. And that was still the standard in 1990 when they played 16 games. But Randall Cunningham, 942 yards to go with 3,500 passing yards in 1990. That was unheard of. Plenty of starting running backs in the NFL today do not get 942 yards rushing with 17 games on the schedule. He finished that year second in the MVP voting and became the first quarterback to really get that close to 1,000 yards, okay? So that's why he's notable for that one season. Steve Young in 1992, with worse numbers than Randall Cunningham, actually won the MVP. He had 3,500 passing yards and 537 rushing yards. He was the NFL MVP because he led the league in passer rating and was what's considered statistically as the league's most efficient running quarterback. And I assume that means average yards per rush mixed in with some other stats. Not really sure, but that's what he did. I mentioned the 1997 season for Kordell Stewart earlier. This was one of the most unique quarterback seasons in NFL history. He had over 3,000 passing yards and only 476 rushing yards. And you say, what's the big deal? Well, to go along with his 3,000 passing yards and 500 yards nearly rushing, he had 11 rushing TDs. Phenomenal and unheard of at that point in time in the NFL peak in the NFL's history. He was a fantasy football monster back then, and 32 total touchdowns for a quarterback back then was a lot. All right. And then, I said I was going to do this chronological, but I see that's not true. My next set of notes are all the way back to Fran Tarkenton. But in 1976, you have to remember the era, Fran Tarkenton for the Vikings, he was 36 years old and he won the MVP. He didn't have a huge rushing total, but his mobility was still at play, and he was noted for how many plays he extended that season in the passing game. And he had 2,500 yards, which was a lot back then, 210 rushing yards. So nearly 3,000 yards of production in an era where that was a little higher than you would normally see in that era for sure. So I think this kind of begs the question, for me at least, what were or are some of the best rushing seasons ever for quarterbacks? I'm glad you asked. Lamar Jackson in 2019 rushed for 1,206 yards. He holds the single season quarterback rushing record in a season for a quarterback, 1,206 yards. That was in 2019. In 2022, Justin Fields for the Bears, he rushed for 1,143 yards. In 2006, Michael Vick broke the 1,000-yard barrier, and this is significant, this is the first time his name has come up, but he's in the discussion here for a reason. He was the first quarterback to break the 1,000 rushing yards in a season total. Michael Vick, he was the trend maker for that. Lamar Jackson in 2020 had 1,005 rushing yards. So multiple 1,000-yard rushing seasons, plus the highest total ever in a season, both for Lamar Jackson And some of you remember Bobby Douglas. He had 968 yards back in 1972, and I'm guessing that set the world on fire with how that happened. One of the earliest rushing QB standouts. And I would have mentioned him more, but he didn't have the career numbers. So let's talk about that. So in a career, for the rushing leaders at quarterbacks, okay, let's put all this in perspective. Number one, you have Lamar Jackson, who's still in his prime. He has 6,410 yards, and that recently passed Vic to become the all-time leader for quarterback rushing yardage. There are plenty of running backs who started on good teams and didn't finish their careers with that many rushing yards. Michael Vick, the one who Lamar passed, he had 6,109 career rushing yards. Another guy we haven't mentioned, but he deserves his place in this because of his career numbers. Cam Newton had 5,628 career rushing yards. Number 4, Russell Wilson, another guy we haven't mentioned, but as a career, 5,568 career rushing yards. He's still an active backup in the NFL. Randall Cunningham, he finished with 4,928 career rushing yards. He's 5th all-time. Josh Allen, who is still in his prime, is already number 6 on the list, chasing Lamar. He is at 4,513 career rushing yards. Steve Young has been retired for 25 years probably, and he has 4,239 yards. Fran Tarkington has been retired for 30-plus years, 3,674 career rushing yards, which is really astronomical for the era that he played in. And even though I don't have their numbers, the top 10 is rounded out by 2 other guys we haven't mentioned. Aaron Rodgers is number 9. Steve McNair is number 10. And you're probably saying to yourself, Steve McNair, I thought he'd be higher on the list than that, but he's not. This is career rushing yards, and he came in at 10, which just proves that he was more of a pocket passer than, the public knew. So that's your top 10 ever in career rushing yards. It's a pretty good list of quarterbacks. So yeah, that's a 30-minute peek at how dual threat quarterbacks. You might as well quit saying that term now. I guess it's a stupid one nowadays, just NFL quarterbacks. That's the evolution of how, if you go back to the 70s and Fran Tarkington and go through the 80s to Cunningham, the 90s to Young, the 90s to Moon, the 90s to Kordell Stewart. If you go back and look at the evolution all the way up to our modern quarterbacks that are lighting up the NFL and fantasy football today, that's how this happened. As a Gen X football fan, hey, I didn't just witness the rise of the dual state quarterback. I saw it every day or every week on highlight reels, all the ESPN, man, if the internet had been alive for Randall Cunningham. And so I saw this happen in real time, and and it's a whole other discussion that we're going to have eventually. I'm very curious and interested and want to talk about the evolution that happened with this in college and high school football as well, because all of this is a related topic. Offensive football changed in my opinion, offensive football changed in the late 90s is where I'm going to put it at the high school level, at least in my area. It changed in the 90s. We'll talk about why I believe that at some other point. And it went all the way upwards to the NFL. But I think the college started it. It dropped down to high school. Then it went up to the pro ranks. That's what I believe happened. So that's where all of this comes from. That's how we got here. Those are the key names. There's a lot of quarterbacks I didn't mention, and you're probably going, dude, but the numbers just weren't there to talk Staubach and Archie Manning and some of these other guys that you're thinking about. Oh, he was a great scrambler. He probably was. But the career rushing yards or the single season rushing yards just weren't there. And I kind of sorted my discussion chronologically by the guys that dominated the numbers and a little bit by reputation. So that's how we got to, where we were with this list of guys that I think influenced all of this. So yeah, that's how we got to the quarterbacks that we have in the NFL today. And so I appreciate you joining me today. Another nostalgic trip, this time through quarterback history. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to follow the show, leave a review, share it with all the people in your life who love sports. We all know somebody that sits in the car and listens to the same old music over and over. Tell them to give us a shot and see if they like it. I really appreciate your time, and we'll be back in a week with something else from GenX Classic Sports. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.